one U.S. plane landed an average of every 3 minutes for several months. Tensions eased as the blockade ended in 1949 without an all-out war in Europe. The Cold War not only involved nations in Europe, but in Asia as well. Throughout the 20th century, the United States became more interested in events taking place in Asia. Maybe this is best seen with the U.S. occupation of Japan following World War II. This ended in 1952, however, the U.S. did retain some bases in Japan. In China, a civil war divided the nation in the years after World War II. The United States supported the nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek. However, he was fighting against communist forces led by Mao Zedong. In 1949, Mao's forces were victorious, and China fell to communism, prompting some to argue that the Truman administration had allowed this to happen and the United States had somehow lost China. Events in Korea would prove to be a little different, because here the Cold War became hot. The Americans had provided economic aid to fight communism in China, not American forces. The same would not be true for Korea. Following the Second World War, Korea was divided. The Soviet Union supported the northern regions of Korea. The Americans supported the south. This map identifies the division of Korea after World War II at the 38th parallel, which is circled. In 1950, Soviet-supported North Korea invaded the south. North Korean forces were initially very successful, as you can see by the arrow pointing to the farthest advance by North Korean forces. President Truman saw this as an attempt to expand communism into a new area, so he applied the containment doctrine to prohibit any future expansion. The United States did not declare war, but acted through the United Nations to pass a resolution calling for force to remove those North Korean forces from the south. The Americans provided the bulk of the troops, and by 1950 the United Nations had undertaken a successful counterattack. Those forces were led by American General Douglas MacArthur. The United Nations forces continued to be successful and pushed the North Koreans closer to the Chinese border. Then the Chinese government began to issue warnings that they might become involved. By November of 1950, they did become involved and were quite successful. Within a short period of time, they had pushed those United Nations troops south of the original border at the 38th parallel. A stalemate then resulted, which lasted about 2 years. Finally, an armistice was reached, ending the fighting in 1953 after Dwight Eisenhower became president. As you can see from this map, not much territory had changed hands between 1950 and 1953. However, nearly 55,000 Americans lost their lives, about 34,000 of which were on the field of battle. Over 100,000 suffered injuries. More than 4 million Asians also died. These include Korean and Chinese soldiers, as well as possibly 2 million Korean civilians. Korea remains divided today. The lecture's focus will now switch to events involving American domestic policy, and will begin with a closer look at the election of 1948. The election of 1948 was an important one, and it pitted 3 candidates against one another. The first was Harry Truman, the Democrat. His goal was to expand the New Deal and protect additional civil rights. The second was Strom Thurmond, a Dixiecrat and former Democrat, who formed his own party in order to preserve segregation. Thomas Dewey was a moderate Republican who did not really run much of an inspired campaign because he felt he would win due to the fact that the Democrats had split over the issue of civil rights. As you can see from this map, Harry Truman won and surprised many with his victory, but many at the time supported the way he handled a series of crises during the Cold War. Here we see a famous photograph of Harry Truman the day after the election as he holds a copy of the Chicago Daily Tribune. No one expected Truman to win this election, and the newspaper had printed their headline a little bit too early. Once he had secured his re-election, Harry Truman announced the Fair Deal. This was his goal to expand on the New Deal. First of all, it called for an increase in the minimum wage, and he also wanted to extend Social Security payments to cover additional workers. Next, he wanted to provide federal aid to public education. Third, he supported expanding civil rights legislation to end discrimination in public places. Fourth, and maybe this is the biggest plan, he supported a national health care plan to help people pay for their medical costs. Only the minimum wage increases and the Social Security extension were passed by Congress, but it showed that the New Deal was here to stay. Next, we'll see how events involving the Cold War impacted domestic politics in the United States. Events abroad in the Cold War influenced anti-communist fears and policies in the United States. HUAC, which stood for the House on Un-American Activities Committee, was a congressional committee investigating the influence of communism in the United States. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, investigative boards forced nearly 3,000 government workers to resign, and 300 were fired. This movie poster on the left shows how Hollywood produced some anti-communist films. It was within this context of the anti-communist hysteria that a demagogue rose in prominence. His name was Joseph McCarthy, and he was a Republican senator from the state of Wisconsin. He was looking for re-election without much of a distinguished record, and so he jumped on the anti-communist bandwagon. Beginning with a speech delivered in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1950, he claimed to have the names of several card-carrying members of the Communist Party who worked for the State Department. The number of communists kept changing, but the accusations continued. He used aggressive tactics and unsubstantiated charges. At one point, he pitted a father against his own son. Initially, he was very popular. Many Republicans didn't agree with his tactics, but they saw him as an effective tool to attack the Democrats. He was condemned by the Senate in 1954 after he accused the Army of harboring communists. The American people watched the hearings on TV. His censure in 1954 was only the third time the Senate had taken such action. He died 3 years later in 1957. Not, however, until he had ruined the lives of numerous individuals. For more information concerning the tactics and impact of Joseph McCarthy's actions, as well as a profile of the Wisconsin senator, you may click on the hyperlink below. A new president entered the White House in 1952, and his policies had a major impact on the country for the next 8 years. Dwight Eisenhower was president from 1953 to 1961, and he enjoyed tremendous popularity. Everyone knew him in 1953 because he was the general who had overseen the famous D-Day invasion in World War II. His vice president was a lot younger. His name was Richard Nixon. He was a former member of the House on Un-American Activities Committee and had a strong reputation as being anti-communist. They're shown here together at the Republican Convention in 1952. As he was running for election, Eisenhower called for a smaller government, and many thought that he might try to dismantle the New Deal because he was the first Republican to hold the presidency for 20 years. His popular image was that of kind of a smiling grandfather, one who got along with just about everyone. However, he worked tirelessly behind the scenes to promote his own views, and he placed his stamp on the actions of the federal government. Eisenhower labeled his domestic set of ideas as dynamic conservatism, and they had a variety of goals. First of all, it called for a reduction in the size of the government. After 20 years of Democratic policies, Eisenhower wanted to reduce the size of government. Next, he supported balanced budgets. He also supported cutting taxes and spending on government programs. Let's see how he did. On the left, we see the goals of dynamic conservatism. On the right, we see reality. First of all, government actually grew as Social Security retirement payments increased, as well as unemployment benefits and the national minimum wage. Budgets were balanced for some years of his presidency, but not for all. Income taxes and spending were each initially cut by 10%, but following recessions, spending actually increased. Finally, Eisenhower led support for the Highway Act, which was a huge public works program. The Highway Act was passed by Congress in 1956 with the strong support of President Eisenhower. It was the government's response to improve the transportation network. First of all, it established the modern highway system and led to the construction of over 40,000 miles of highways in the United States. Its goals were twofold. First of all, it improved the transportation system, but it was also designed with the Cold War in mind to improve the defense of the nation. It was largely funded by a gasoline tax and became the most expensive public works program in American history. This lecture has addressed a wide range of subjects.